Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Q&A session on India's journey beyond COVID-19. I want to thank all of you, for joining us today and taking the time to help us to understand your questions and the issues you're raising. I'm Shannon Olsson. I'm director of the ECHO Network, and I know it may seem strange to participate in a discussion on moving beyond a crisis that we're very much in the grips of. But it's this type of forward-thinking mindset of hope that is really at the core of the ECHO Network's focus. So for those of you who weren't part of our first session last week, I wanted to start by explaining the purpose of these sessions. The ECHO Network is a social innovation partnership steered by the principal scientific advisor to the government of India. And ECHO is intending to unite citizens, government, industry, academia, and private organizations to tackle real-world problems through communication and interdisciplinary scientific research. In order to do this, we first have to understand what the issues currently are in human and environmental ecosystems. So to that end, we started by uniting a unique group of economists, healthcare professionals, lawyers, CEOs, activists, and journalists to share their dreams of how science and technology can take India forward beyond this COVID-19 pandemic. So through a series of on and offline discussions, we established a white paper known as India's Journey Beyond COVID-19 that you can see on our website, www.echonetwork.in. The intention of this paper was to start conversations, first among these thought leaders, but also then more with the broader communities on how science and technology can play a role in India's future. So we're having these conversations with you today. We also hope that these conversations that we're having will actually generate more conversations amongst your own communities for how we can move forward and bring science and society closer together. So we hope that you will reach out to us further to see how we can continue these discussions with you. For the past week, we've been listening to the questions you've been raising, and we will be asking them to our esteemed speakers today. And there will be also time at the end of the session to take a few extemporaneous questions that you can write in the Q&A function that you see on the Zoom screen in front of you. But as you can imagine, we probably are not going to be able to get to all of the questions that you're going to raise. So if you read a question that is similar to the one you wanted to ask, or one that which you really want an answer to, please upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up button. So at the end of the session, what we'll do is try to get to the questions that have the most upvotes and take those first. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. I have had the privilege of working with these three wonderful men over the past few weeks, engaging with them. They have really wonderful viewpoints on a variety of issues, and so it's a real wonderful opportunity to get the three of them together for further discussion today. I'll start with introducing Arunabha Ghosh. He is a public policy professional. He's an advisor, an author, a columnist, and he also builds institutions. He is the co-founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water since 2010. And he's led CEW as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions for 7 years in a row. And it's among the world's 20 best climate think tanks. He has experience in 45 different countries. He's worked with Princeton, Oxford, UNDP, and the WTO. In 2018, the UN Secretary General nominated him for UN's Committee for Development Policy, and the government of India has currently appointed him co-chair of the Energy, Environment, and Climate Change for India's forthcoming STIP policy, STIP 2020. So Arunabha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Our next participant today is Chirag Gajjar. He leads the Subnational Climate Action and Climate Program at the World Resources Institute in India, where he oversees climate mitigation initiatives, and he's been working to promote solutions for climate change for over 15 years. He oversees the work of a team that aims to catalyze and support climate action by states, cities, and businesses for the next coming years in India and beyond. And before joining WRI, he had worked extensively on carbon market projects for various mechanisms. And he's a well-known expert in GHG accounting and inventory. Chirag, it's very nice to have you here today and see you again.
Pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker to introduce today is Crispino Lobo. He has over 30 years of engagement in rural development issues on all levels, from ground level implementation, program management, to policy engagement. He has founded 4 nonprofit institutions: the Watershed Organization Trust, the Sampada Trust, the Sanjivani Institute of Empowerment and Development, and the Sampada Entrepreneurship and Livelihood Foundation. Collectively, these institutions have impacted the lives of over 3.7 million people in 8 different states in India. They have trained 475,000 people from over 27 states and 63 countries, and have supported the development works of over 4,800 villages. Crispino has been a regular participant at the pre-budget consultations on agriculture for the last 22 years. Crispino, thank you also for being part of our group today.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'd like to begin with our question session. So the first question that I want to ask to all 3 of you is a really personal question, because we wanted to get your particular viewpoints on why are you here? What is your motivation to be part of this effort? Both the broad effort that we were part of with the white paper, but also this discussion today. So Arunabha, why don't you start?
Shannon, thank you. And once again, thanks for involving me in the effort. It's this is just one more milestone on that journey, and it's been a delight to work with you and with those on this webinar, but also those who participated as part of the larger group. I had one big motivation to be part of this, and that is how to not lose the moment. We cannot expect or hope for progress on the basis of terrible humanitarian tragedies. That said, terrible humanitarian tragedies do give us a chance to step back and relook at the overall system of how we organize our economy, how we organize our ecology, and how we organize the ethics that will then, draw a thread between the two. And of course, that could, at one end or the other, strengthen or weaken or further fracture divisions in our society. And it could, for better or for worse, make our politics more responsive or not. So I felt that it is important that individually, as individuals or as members of particular organizations, keep working on what kind of pathway that we chart out of the recovery. My own organization has published something called Jobs, Growth, and Sustainability. But I felt that a more diverse group that brings in, as you were describing, people from different backgrounds, and then uses that as a template to then invite more voices, actually helps to keep that conversation going, and to keep reminding ourselves that we cannot afford to lose this moment. So that was the single big motivation to be part of the process.
Thank you so much, and we're so glad that you agreed to do this. Chirag, let's hear from you. What is your motivation to be part of this effort?
Thank you so much, Shannon, for first of all having me and having a part of the process that we just went through, and also inviting me to speak here and have a conversation with the audience. I would agree with Arunabha. This is a moment that we cannot just let go of. And since the coronavirus pandemic started, I mean, even before it hit India, I've been hearing about the news of some of the colleagues who have been affected in other parts of the globe that I've been working with. And then it hit India. We are seeing that the communities are being tried, tested to the extreme on every aspect of the life. It's a simultaneous health, social, and economic crisis, and it is laying bare how well communities are planned and managed. Its impact is showing the extent to which how each of us are able to function or not, especially during the time of crisis. So we all have been thinking, similar questions on the same topics. That why are we seeing such implications on our economy, on our society? Why do we see the level of preparedness or unpreparedness, to be precise? Why do we see the state of our delivery system the way they are? And the extent to which health and livelihood is vulnerable. So this was surely not the case before the COVID-19, but can we actually go back to the scenario before COVID-19, which led us to the situation that we are in today? I think not. And I think that's one of the biggest motivation for me. We need to make sure that our communities are functional even during the times of the crisis, and make sure that I can contribute in making our communities safe, smart, inclusive, and sustainable in whatever smallest way possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult, right? I mean, especially because we're, as I said, we're right in the middle of this crisis still to really try to look forward and not backward. But I agree, we have to do this. Crispino, what about you? What is your motivation?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Shannon, you invited me, so I said yes. And the reason,
Yeah.
and the reason is, if there's one thing that COVID has taught us, is that we are not islands in isolation. We are all interdependent, we are all interlinked. Whatever concerns we have is also impacted by the concerns and activities or efforts of others. And so post-COVID, there's a new world ahead of us. We needed to revisit the old areas of work or concerns, the old issues, and uncover how they're related to all the other issues that we have been grappling with. You could not see a single problem in isolation anymore. So you needed to bring people from different diverse backgrounds, competences, skills, and experience, and focus on a particular area from all these various lenses. And that's the opportunity and platform you offered us. The second incentive is, of course, each one of us comes with our own expertise. But now, post-COVID, it was important to take those ideas and throw it into the ideas of other approaches and disciplines and perspectives, not only to inform those perspectives, but also to revisit and reevaluate and review our own perspectives. Because only by this dialogue, and this dialectic of discourse, can you really come up with an approach which can seek and acquire consensus and determination to solve the problem. The second issue was, you made it very clear that this is a roadmap post-COVID that you would now present to government and at the levels of policy making and decision. And that's important because no matter how successful you are at the lower level, and no matter if you've got the right pathway, unless you're able to sell it in a way or get the buy-in of government and policymakers and administrators, together with all the other important framework actors in society, you wouldn't be able to really upscale good practices or success stories. And there's a tremendous urgency in the post-COVID world that we need success at scale and rapidly. So this is the key reason why, apart from the fact that you invited me, that I happily and gladly joined it. And I'm very grateful for the tremendous opportunity of meeting such excellent people and men and women of accomplishment and experience. It was a really fulfilling and professionally assuring exercise. Thank you.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to work with you as well. And you brought up a very good point, which is that we have to actually open the floor up to each other, and that these policy decisions have to also be influenced by what we hear from different sectors of society, which is one of the purpose of today. So I want to now open up for some of the questions that we've received. And I'd like to start with a question for Arunabha. And this question comes from Paramjit Singh, who's the ex-director of Botanical Survey of India. And he asked, as we have seen mass migration to villages during this recent crisis, is the urban job-centric model of livelihood in India sustainable? And I would add, if not, how do you see efforts in science and technology helping to generate some sustainability given the current issues that have been raised from this crisis?
Thanks, Shannon, and thank you, Paramjit, for that question. Two responses. One, what do we do with the sustainability of jobs in urban areas? And second, is there an opportunity to revive the rural economy in a different way altogether? On the first, of course, while many millions of migrants have gone back, many millions of migrants will come back. The question is, what kind of urban economy will they come back to? And this is where I think that it is very clear that what does the urban economy offer? It offers income, but it does not offer good housing. It does not offer water and sanitation. It does not offer sustainable mobility. It does not offer sustainable cooling for very poor people in extremely crowded circumstances. And all of this makes it highly unsustainable in terms of the kind of productive work that they could expect to be doing. But each of these areas offers opportunities. For energy, distributed energy creates 7 times more jobs than utility scale energy. So using distributed energy for low income areas, using decentralized water and sanitation infrastructure, looking at sustainable building design and sustainable cooling, and I'm sure Chirag has ideas on sustainable mobility, creates the conditions for them not only to live well as citizens, but to participate as effective economic agents. Very quickly, on the rural side as well, even if 10% of the migrants who have gone back to the villages chose not to come back to the cities, we are talking about maybe anywhere in the order of 10 or 20 million people, added to the rural economy. And we need to make sure that the regeneration of the rural economy is also built on sustainable principles and is not entirely dependent on short-termist kind of extension of loans, etc., that or subsidies that the government might give. So again, this is where a different way of viewing the rural economy becomes important. On agriculture, we see, for instance, natural farming, regenerative farming is far more friendly to the small and marginal farmer, is more climate resilient, and you can do it much more in small plots of land. The world's largest such experiment is underway in Andhra Pradesh. We see out of the farm, there's about a $50 billion opportunity of using distributed energy with efficient motors to create jobs in income generating activities. CW has launched a program called Powering Livelihoods. So the point here is, to answer your question about science and technology, is the technologies exist. The innovations in business models and in deployment, both in the urban and the rural areas, is where you need to involve the communities, because they have to be co-owners, not just recipients of our grants. If we did that, then maybe a more resilient recovery is possible.
So thank you, Arunabha. I'm actually going to go to Chirag now, because you have a lot of experience with these technologies, and there's actually a question related to that comes from Cynthia Anand, who's a communications manager at Cambridge Clean Tech, and she wants to know basically, where do you see the role of the technologies? For example, distributed energy that Arunabha mentioned, but also Cynthia brought up carbon reduction and sustainable manufacturing in reducing climate change and leading to some of these sustainable opportunities and job opportunities in India. Could you comment on that?
Thank you so much, Shannon. And I hope I'm audible. In previous intervention, I think I will message that I'm not audible. Is the voice okay now?
In the worst case, what you can do is try shutting off your video, and then it'll at least have your voice.
Sure. No problem. So you completely agree with Arunabha. The technologies do exist, and I read a report somewhere which talks about the technologies that we need till 2040 are already in existence. It's precisely the interventions or the innovations in the business model that needs to be looked upon. So no doubt, technology is going to play very crucial role, very key role. Now, while there has been significant improvement in the energy and resource efficiency, there has been an absolute reduction in the environmental impact. Why is that the case? Why is that we are not moving towards more favorable, environmentally more favorable technologies? And that's where the real question comes into the picture. How do we make technologies the centerpiece of our fight against the climate change? What I'll do is I'll take a couple of examples here and talk about the technological innovations and put a few questions out there for all of us to discuss and ponder on. So let's first talk about power generation. We all know that renewable energy technologies are out there, and India has adopted significant targets. One of the other things that we can talk about is nuclear power, which is of course free of carbon emissions. We are yet to harness it in a truly safe manner, and as well as in a cost-effective manner. Can there be an innovation within the nuclear power generation? Probably. A Canadian company is doing a research on it, which looks at nuclear fusion energy power plant. Could that be an answer? Maybe, maybe not. The second example I want to take is from the transport sector. The demand for transport, as we know, is going to increase. There's no doubt about that. We have been looking at alternative solutions to petrol and diesel car. We are looking at electric mobilities, right? But we need, the battery is a concern into this scenario. So what do we need? We need more efficient batteries and more efficient battery charging technology. University of Surrey is claiming to have made a scientific breakthrough about materials that are 1,000 to 10,000 times more powerful than the existing materials. So can we have technology using those materials that will allow electric cars to travel to similar distances that of petrol cars without need for lengthy recharging breaks? Possible. The technological innovation is on the way. The third is around manufacturing. So around 30% of global emissions come from industry. In India, this share is little less, little about 7%, excluding the electricity consumption of the industrial sector. So how can technologies help the industrial sector? Now, the focus should be on capturing the carbon from air, and it's going to play a crucial role in the coming years, which will help that, reducing carbon emissions is easier. There is a company in British Columbia who is claiming to remove 1 ton of CO2 every day from air. They further claim that the technology can remove far more CO2 per acre of land footprint than plant and trees. So you see, there are technological innovations which are happening. What we need is for governments, research institutions, philanthropists to come together to create an environment and invest in technologies that will limit the climate change. Thank you.
So, Chirag, you brought up an important point that there is a lot of need for research out there. And there's actually a specific question related to that from Rajnika Hirani, who's the head of sustainability and business at the Francis Crick Institute. And she actually, you started this at the end of what you just said, but I'd like you to expound a little bit on what actually can Indian laboratories do to help reduce climate change. I mean, they obviously research on these new technologies and more efficient batteries. You mentioned a number of things, but what are some other ways that Indian specifically laboratories can do to help our livelihoods and increase the sustainability of our systems in India?
Sure, thanks, Shannon. I hope, thank you for that question. I hope the laboratories that you're talking about are climate laboratories, or even if they are not climate laboratories. Let me answer this question in a slightly different manner. I think there are two ways we can look at what not just Indian laboratories, but any Indian entity can do. So one is we can look at co-creating solutions. We need solutions that are created in an inclusive, harmonious and a sustainable manner that contribute to solving the problem that we're trying to address, that is of climate change. And second is we need to be able to access the external support system. There are lots of partnerships which are available out there with key supporters or even within the ecosystem that you're working on. So they can enable to coordinate with and learn from each other. They allow access to the resources that are needed or the expertise that we need. So it can accelerate the solutions by providing a favorable environment. Now, scientists typically, and this is very true for the climate scientists, those who are working on this topic, they see climate change as a physical phenomenon that can be observed, quantified, and measured. And the solutions that they prescribe are straightforward: reduce GHG emissions using technologies, and then remove the CO2 emissions from the atmosphere by protecting these things, right? How do we achieve this, and who should bear the burden of implementing these solutions? Depends on the worldviews and beliefs and values and attitudes of different entities that are involved in it. Now I can expand a bit more on this, but I'll leave it to you if this is sufficient.
So based on that insights from the terms of laboratories, I actually want to turn to an area that has been of keen interest with a lot of people from our social media channels, which is agriculture. So Crispino, I'm very glad you're part of our panel today because you can take those questions. So I have a couple of questions for you regarding sustainability in agriculture, and they're somewhat related. So I'll pose both of them to you, and you can put them together as you like. So one is from Chapodira Kushalapa, and he is the Dean of Forestry at the University of Agriculture and Horticultural Sciences in Shivamoga. And he asked, how is it possible to incentivize sustainable farming systems? Obviously, given his location, he's interested in the Western Ghats, but that can be really expanded to across the country of India, because sustainable farming is still a very much a niche effort done by very specific areas of the country. And a related question that's by Nirmalaya Chatterjee, who's a fellow at ATREE, is how do we make our farming communities more resilient to transition perhaps from seasonal to continuously producing agricultural systems that also retain the sustainability. So I think they're different issues, but they're somewhat related. So I'd like to see what your answer is, especially extending from what Chirag was talking about, given technologies and research that's needed. You're muted, Crispino.
Yeah. So first I'll address the first question. How do you incentivize? You see, we are in aspirational times, you see, and people's aspirations are built upon and driven by the access to income that they have. So if you want to change people's behavior, then you have to present them a pathway that can help increase their income to the levels that satisfy the aspirational needs. That's also applicable to farmers. They will change their behavior and their cropping patterns only if it makes sense. That means to say, they earn more money than what they spend to earn it, number one, and they're also assured that it will be yielding a growing stream of income over time. Okay. Now, specific to, if you apply this to the Western Ghats, you know, specifically, the Western Ghats are very interesting. Actually, they are areas of high rainfall, but also of high runoff because of the hill slopes, and they also have a coastal belt. Now, if you take the hilly areas, they're largely areas where horticulture crops grow. That means fruit crops, vegetables, etc. can grow. If you look at the coastal belts, it's largely rice. Now you see in India, probably all over the world, only those crops are successful at scale and adopted by a large group of farmers if they can generate sustainable income to the farmers. Now, if you look at the fruit industry or even the cereal industry, where processing industries have been formed, where the value chain has been developed, be it in sugarcane, be it also in other crops that can be processed, those kind of crops are adopted at scale. So for the Konkan belt, like the Western Ghats, we have, of course, mangoes, we have jackfruits, we have a lot of other crops that can be grown, fruit species, or even vegetables. If we can develop robust value chains for those crops, we would be able to incentivize farmers to change their behavior. In fact, the Konkan farmers who grow the Alfonso mangoes are by no means largely poor. I mean, they're very successful because they've managed also the value chain, and it's getting even more sophisticated and better. For crops like rice, for instance, the farmers in the Punjab and Haryana grow it these are not really rice growing areas, but they've taken it en masse because they have a very good support price, minimum support price. So we need to also bring this level of policy intervention in terms of minimum support prices to crops where you cannot easily develop a value chain because of various reasons, but can incentivize farmers to adopt those crops at scale. That would be for the area of how to incentivize behavior, which means basically ensure that market access is improved, returns on investment in farming get better, and more value is captured by the farmers themselves. Okay, it could be any form, either value chain or minimum support price. With regard to the other question, it has three layers. One is, how do you make farming more resilient? That means, of course, the aspect of climate change, as well as resilient to market shocks. And at the same time, the other part of the question is, how do you also ensure that ecosystems are not jeopardized in the process? So there are three aspects that have to be addressed if you want to find a pathway that also leads to income sustainably to the farmers. Okay. Now, there are various technologies and learnings that have evolved over the last several decades And they do offer hope. For instance, climate change. We are getting better at predicting weather conditions, and the government through IMD is also increasing its effort at providing crop weather advisories to farmers. In fact, we are working with them, and we have also launched an app that can help to localize those advisories down to the farm level eventually. So that's the pathway to go. So better forecasting, better advisory services, and also the way we do farming has to change. It has to also become more robust, more able to cope with changes as well as shocks. For instance, the whole focus on soil health, which was never a concern in agriculture sciences for a long time, is now becoming the centerpiece of agriculture interventions. We've had so many interventions from the government level. But the idea of reducing chemical use and inputs and improving soil health through mediational impacts, efforts or remedial effects, greater input of biomass as well as carbon into the soil to improve its vitality and its biome is now gaining more and more value, you see. So nature-friendly agriculture, which focuses on a very light, traditional systems of fertigation, of fertilization, of pest and disease control, plant protection, is now gaining ground, which was always done before, but now being brought in more as a segregated package, supported also by policy and government or public resources. Because 40% of agriculture output is made possible by pollinators, for instance, which come from environmental service. They're an environmental service and nature. So if we undertake practices in agriculture which protect nature, protect the soil health, while also yielding income, by precision farming systems, which are also climate responsive and adaptive, therefore, I do believe it is possible by bringing science and managerial technologies as well as policy changes. And the three big changes that have been made recently following COVID, which is that Atmanirbhar program with regard to agriculture, offer several very interesting opportunities that can possibly make this situation possible. Thank you.
So a lot of the ideas you mentioned regarding management and also crop choice and incorporating ecology and things, there's also a lot of traditional knowledge also out there associated with this. So I want to continue with you, Crispino, because this is actually a question that was brought up by Ayanadar Arunachalam. He's the Assistant Director General of ICAR, and he wanted to know how we can actually incorporate traditional knowledge better into our systems, agriculture, but also our economic systems as well. So could you comment based upon some of the ideas that you just presented on how traditional knowledge can also play a role here?
Yes, it's already happening. But I think what the doctor says is, how do you upscale it and make it its impact at scale? I think we have the ICR system, and we also have a formal MOU with the ICR system. They have a huge amount. It's a repository of knowledge, experience, and technologies. And the good thing is they have a lot of young, dynamic scientists who want to. We need now, and that's one part. The other part, this game, if you may say, is not only the scientific establishment, but also the government. And the government has clearly made its intentions clear in terms of agriculture. They want it to succeed because whatever we do, over 60% of our people depend upon agriculture for their sustenance. And the government is putting in the resources now, including changes in policy. And the third is, of course, the farming community. And the good thing is they are also quite exposed now for various reasons to new ways of doing things. They also realize that you can't repeat the way we did things in the past if we want to get new outcomes for the future. So there's a coming together of science, government, farmers, and people at large. And you see, the consumer is important, and the consumer is getting more and more sensitive to what he consumes, he or she consumes, right? And so it's a wonderful amalgam of things coming together, which if we act fast and in a prudent and wise manner, I do believe we could meet all these objectives. And we need to engage more with the scientific community. The scientific community must get out and engage more with the farming community if these things are to be accelerated and upscaled.
Thank you very much, Crispino. That's a really important aspect that was brought up by very many people that we've been interacting with. Arunabha, there's a really important question, and I see it's also reflected in the Q&A as well. which is about, the uncertainty aspect. So Vasudeva has brought up this, the COVID era has uncertainty with respect to what to grow and where to market and what technology to help. And I know he's asked this addressed to Chirag, so I also want to give Chirag a chance to answer this. But first, Arunabha, because also this was an issue brought up by Manjari Ghosh, which is, how do we sustain this and sustain our livelihoods through disasters? Because we're actually in a disaster. We're in a crisis, a health and humanitarian crisis right now. And these won't stop, right? There will be cyclones coming. There will be disasters coming up in India all the time. And also with climate change, as we all know, that actually creates a series of shocks that you mentioned early on in your comments. So how do we deal with these disasters and still maintain some sense of livelihoods, sustaining the livelihoods through them?
Sure. Shannon, you're aware, scientists here would know that as scientists, we tend to be conservative and we worry about false positives. We don't want to confirm our hypotheses lest we get it wrong. But in reality, often we ignore the converse, we ignore the false negatives. And that's because we don't look at the tail end of the risks. When we think about public health challenges, when we think about climate-related shocks, when we think about agricultural shocks, we often end up looking only at the averages. And then we say, well, over the last 30 years, we've had 5 years of drought. So 25 years, we are fine. And therefore, we have to think much more now about a razor-sharp focus on tail-end risks. Those that have very low probability, but if they were to come true, the impacts are devastating. And then they have their own feedback effects. As you can see through the pandemic, it's a public health crisis, which then converts into an economic crisis, which then converts into a social crisis. Similarly, with climate change, the kinds of cyclones that we saw, Amphan and Nisarg on either side of our coast, they're once in a century, once in 30 years. The frequency of these and the intensity of these will increase. And how do we then respond? How does a crop failure or water crisis result in a crop failure? Crop failure results in a severe social crisis. Now, when we start thinking like that, number one response then is that we create a much more robust, what I call a resilience atlas on climate or public health, that on a high resolution level, 25 by 25 kilometer level, we are able to understand the vulnerabilities across the country in advance. Second, we need something called an integrated emergency surveillance mechanism. Right now, what we do is we provide advance warning of an impending storm or an impending cyclone. What we are not able to do yet is deliver that real-time information as the disaster is unfolding. And that makes it very hard for people who have small businesses, etc. You don't know as a fisherman, when can you go back out? You don't know as a shopkeeper, when can you reopen your shop? And all that impacts the cash flow into the household. Number three, we need to develop, and this is again back to where science and community comes together, or science and citizen comes together, is an emergency response framework that is universal and unified. This is what Japan did, for instance, after Fukushima, where it brought in these modules, training from school children to households, etc. What should be your response during an emergency and after an emergency? Once you're able to put all of these systems in place, Shannon, we're able to see that we build in far more resilience for the economy. And should disaster strike, we're able to come out of it faster. Just one data point and I'll close. In the last 20 years, India has suffered losses of up to about 13.5 lakh crore due to natural disasters or due to vector-borne diseases, not counting the impact of the current pandemic. So when we are thinking that we are going to invest 20 lakh crore back into the economy as a stimulus out of this crisis, we can think, what could we have done to avoid this massive loss of about $200 billion over the course of two decades. Every $1 invested in resilience saves you $2 in losses. So the biggest lesson from the pandemic and going forward, because the crises will get worse, is that prevention is better than cure. But you can only do that if we focus on the tail end and not the averages.
So I'd also like to follow up before I go to Chirag and allow him to answer this question, is how do we prepare our workforce for this, right? So this also is a question that was brought up by Ravi Pallavalli, who's at Florida International University in the US. And he wanted to know, with so many unemployable graduates in India, how do we better reform our higher education for community efforts and honestly preparing them for dealing with these disasters and improving efficiencies, that obviously will be part of that. So, you know, besides obviously policy changes and better allocation of funds, how do we actually also prepare our young people to be able to deal with these sorts of situations in the future?
Number one, and Crispino started his response with that, is to manage aspirations. And I don't mean that in a sort of way of saying that you cannot aspire to a better life. The concept of human development at its core is about expanding freedoms and capabilities. It is not about necessarily only expanding wealth. Our entire education system, whether it's formal or informal, skills training or otherwise, has to be about, here are capabilities that you can then deploy in different ways. That has to, and I know this is a meta answer, but we don't get to systemic changes by incremental tweaking of policy. However, number two, the informality of our workforce could potentially also be the strength. Informal does not necessarily mean that you have to be destitute or that you have to have terrible working conditions. The informality of the workforce perhaps makes the workforce more agile. We've been looking at, to take one example of, say, deployments of renewable energy across the country. We've already created about 100,000 jobs in India in renewables, much more in decentralized energy. Now, how can this workforce, which is kind of fitting mirrors in the desert or wind turbines, how can it be mobile across different projects across the country, rather than be embedded like, say, a coal miner in one place for the rest of her or his life? Once we bring in the agility that comes from applicable skills, then you're making the workforce also far more resilient. One more thing, underlying all of this has to be a degree of social protection of the workforce, which is missing. We have it in rural areas, but we don't have it for urban workers. We don't have food security. We don't have basic minimum income coming into the household in terms of cash. We don't have good enough, access to banking services. Without this basic level of social security, it is impossible to assume that someone who's, say, 22, has just come out of a regional college, has to support another family of maybe 6 back home, will be able to switch to something else. They will need time to be able to do that. Rich countries are doing that. Germany put in billions into the hands of small businesses and entrepreneurs and workers. Singapore has done the same. Rich countries are doing it for their workers. We are a poorer country, which is a labor surplus economy. We have to take this as part of that social contract that the state, or rather that the citizen, should demand from the state. Without that, none of the rest, the upskilling, the reskilling, the agility in the workforce, is going to be possible, because you're leaving people very much at the margins of above poverty or falling back below multidimensional aspects of poverty.
So Chirag, based on what Arunabha just said, to get this started, I'd like to hear from you how you think technologies can help with this. This is what Vasudeva was bringing up, and also just a question from Kanchan Chopra that is somewhat related is how to get the green technologies on the radar for state and central governments as well, and what mechanisms can we that are either already in place or can we put in place to make this happen. So based on what Arunabha was just saying, could you comment from the technology aspect?
Sure, thanks for the question. So I think, accessibility of technology or accessibility of information or openness, this is more like a management approach, right? So if you want to make anything which is very much functional, then you need to make sure that it's accessible and open in nature, including the delivery systems, including the information systems, and so on and so forth. In terms of the making green technologies or renewable energy technologies accessible by the state and the government, I think there are lots of schemes and policies that are currently being in place. What really needs to happen is we need to be able to bring all of this, technology players, the regulators, and as Arunabha pointed out, the demand for this technology together on a common platform. And this is where platforms like EcoNetwork or few other platforms that we are a part of can play a significant role. Now, in terms of implementing, I also want to quickly respond to one of the earlier questions around how to make, I think there was on the Q&A, how to make response in a more friendly manner. Or, so the idea is that the more you make the digital technology, the platforms that you create, right? We have online classrooms which are happening right now, students that are going through online platforms. So this technology platforms, this has become a ritual now for me. So these technology platforms are already out there. Sometimes my daughter even sits through some of these presentations and she puts forward some of these questions to me, although she's only 4 years old. So she's getting that, learning from me right away, right now. I think we need to make it more accessible. One of the challenges, the knowledge around the climate change has become predominantly limited to the society that we operate in, or limited to the climate society that we operate in. We need to be more open about communicating this knowledge in a language that people others understand. If I start talking about RCP 2.6, RCP 2.5, then very few people would understand that kind of a discussion. So how do we convert that into a language that others are able to understand? So if I go to a city administrator and say that, under RCP 8.5 scenario, the likelihood of emissions rising more than 40% is significant, which will result in temperature rise of 4.7 degrees. He won't understand it. I have to tell him that because of this scenario, if you're a coastal city, the sea level is going to rise by 3.5 to 4.2 meters, and that's going to submerge nearly 50 or 60% of the landmass of the city. That's the language they understand. That's how they're able to connect the dots. And the same thing needs to be implemented for the students, for making sure that these technologies are understood by all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very important part of also building resilience, as we've been talking about throughout this session. I'd like to take a couple of questions from the Q&A. One is for Crispino. It comes from a very close friend of mine, Subaharan Kesavan, who's at NVAR in Bangalore. And he's interested in this migration of laborers that we've had from villages to urban areas. And he wants to know that, during this current crisis, they've gone back to the villages, but how will they be able to get back to farm work because it's physically demanding and it also gets them less monetary benefits after having better earnings from urban jobs? And you talked about value chains, right? So this is really where I think this also plays a role, but also, telling them that they need to stay in villages, he says maybe looks myopic. So how do we increase this? How do we really realize this value chain aspect of bringing our better prospects for our agricultural communities? You're muted, Crispino.
Yes, sorry about that. I think it's very clear that the bulk of the migrants will come back to their jobs in cities. I mean, estimates range from 80 to 90%. And so that's one part of the whole issue. As Arunabha said, I mean, unless conditions are improved for them in these urban industrial areas, they're all going to be as vulnerable as before to another shock that might come up. So that's a huge opportunity and challenge also, is how can we bring about changes in their working conditions and in their income so that they begin to develop stakes in these regions and become part of the socio-economic landscape of these states, these areas. With regard to those in the farming sector, it's going to be quite challenging because many of these people are not going to be able to do the hard work that NREGA offers, for instance. Even many of them can't do it. But now there are opportunities, and for that you'll need a consortium of government, the private sector, the civil society sectors, and the industrial or the commercial and technology establishment of this country. It can't be done alone, because that's how sophisticated and complex these economic systems have become. And the good thing is that there have been changes being made in the law. For instance, in the Contracts Act, for instance, contract farming, they've changed the rules now. They've also made modifications to the Essential Commodities Act, as well as to the APMC Act, which has all been impacting and in many ways holding down various aspects of the agriculture world. And now they've set up a huge fund for promoting agricultural innovation. So of course, the jury is still out. We have just begun, but I do believe that if there's one thing that COVID has taught us is that old certitudes no longer apply, and that the world has become a lot more open. Digital connectivity has become accessible to right down to the village, and it's going to be it offers chances, a lot of opportunities that we need to take advantage of if we are going to be able to support this 20% that remains behind, as well as to improve the lot of the 80% who might return.
So related to that, there's a few sort of related questions that I hope the attendees will allow me to kind of conglomerate into a single question. So there's a lot of questions about how to actually achieve this on the ground. Okay, so one from Nirmalia, she asked about your chain issues and how exactly can we realize that? I mean, so she mentioned maybe some sort of AML model, the sort of distributed community supported efforts, or could you give some really ground realities? Because, and I'd like to actually hear some follow-ups from Chirag and Arunabha about this, because that is a big issue, and that's something that's very close that we've talked about from our white papers, taking away stuff that's just all up in the air and saying, what do we really need to do right now that's actually achievable? So I'll start with you, Crispino.
Yes, I mean, of course, AMUL model is a very successful model, but one must not forget that it took a visionary and a totally passionate and committed person to drive it against many odds. It took a government that also supported it and put in the national resources that were required. And it also took the setting up of a cooperative framework act that incentivized farmers to also become part of that effort. And we must not forget that because politics in India is democracy-based and vote-based, that the same farmers, by organizing themselves into these income-generating activities, became also the political class, or rather the base on which the political system could be sent signals on where resources have to be invested. So unless farmers get organized economically as well as socially and are backed by appropriate changes in the law, where they can send very strong political signals, you will not be able to get the kind of resources on a sustained basis to make such kind of transformations possible. But is it possible? Yes. And there are a lot of efforts. And we have to hope, and we have to keep working towards that. And who knows? There are no easy answers.
Chirag, what about you? What do you think we need to do right now? You mentioned many, many different options for technologies that are already in existence. What do you see as the thing that we need to do today? That are one or two things that you think need to happen right now that are realistic?
When we are dealing with the multi-channel crisis, including the migrant crisis, climate change, the epidemic, and one of the important things for me, picking up from what Crispino talked about the political role or the leadership role of the politics in India, we need to make sure that our city and rural governments or urban and rural governments are empowered to respond to a crisis that we are dealing with at hand. I think decentralization of some of the issues and their ability to focus on delivery of services at the local level, I think that's like more likely to provide a better option or a solution to the crisis that we are looking at right now. Um, it's something that we will keep on seeing a lot of issues that are going to crop up in future as well. If climate change continues to worsen, we are going to see a lot more severity of pandemic, or maybe increase in the frequency of the pandemics in the future, including many other things. Let me take an example of Kerala. This is the fourth consecutive year the state has been witnessing a disaster or some sort of a extreme event that's happening. First couple of years, the floods, and then this pandemic, which has already been happening. Look at the response from the Kerala over the last few years. It has evolved significantly. What it has done is it has allowed its different district administrators to go and trace the implement the tracing method to make sure that you're able to contain the spread of the disease, and then ensure that the numbers do not go basically. There are lots of examples out there. We need to make sure that these examples are communicated across the board and we learn from each other. We've prepared a compendium of several cities in India who have implemented some of these practices. I think we need to make this more mainstream. We need to talk about how cities are going to be able to deliver the solutions that we hope for the country to deliver.
Thank you, Chirag. And Arunabha, you get the last word. What do we need to do today? You've actually mentioned several things. I'd just like you to kind of put the nail on the head and tell me one or two things.
Well, number one is we can't afford to fly in the blind, which means that we need far better information and understanding of the ground realities as they are unfolding during this pandemic. The rest of us, we can pontificate about, the grand recovery, but we have very poor understanding of ground realities because the official surveys that get conducted, they have, for justifiable reasons, they have a lag because of the scale of what is undertaken, and so you will only know next year what was the situation, in September this year. So we need quick, thin sample surveys looking at rural labor, looking at consumption expenditure in the households, and factory establishment surveys. In fact, just yesterday I was talking to the officials in the Department of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises of one of our largest states, and they have started such a process precisely to understand exactly what is going on. At CW, we are going to do a survey called Tracking Rural India During COVID, trick surveys. So we need this information coming very quickly. Number two, we have to save small businesses from going under. So cash injection to give that working capital so that businesses, what I mean by business, it could be a shop, it could be a small restaurant employing another 10 people in a small town. That's what I mean by small businesses. But if they have the cash injection and they can then keep paying salaries, it will save us from the severe economic shock that the households are facing. Once these two things are done, then comes a focus on the decentralized rebuilding of the economy. And this is where the opportunities in the urban areas as well as in the rural areas comes in. because the assumption that these people, the millions of migrant workers, as well as those who were already in rural areas, those who we have abandoned by virtue of our inability to respond and keep them or make them more resilient, we have to make sure that they come out of this more self-reliant. Rather than the country being more self-reliant, it is the communities that have to be more self-reliant. And decentralized energy, water, natural farming, sustainable housing, these are all avenues for new investment to come in, more employment coefficients in these sectors, and of course they are more sustainable. So data, cash inflows, and then decentralized recovery.
Thank you very much. So on that note, we are now out of time. It's just a little bit after 6 now, so we will have to close the session. I could talk with the three of you for many more hours. I learn something new every time I speak with you, and I want to thank you for joining the network on this journey, and I hope you'll continue to work with us in the future. We very much value your insights, and thank you to all the attendees for your questions. They were wonderful and informative and helped us to really get ideas from you as well. So I hope they'll all join us for our next session. That will be next Thursday at the same time. This time it will be on human and environmental ecosystems. So I hope you'll join us. And thank you, Arunabha. Thank you, Chirag. Thank you, Crispino, very, very much. And stay safe, everyone, and stay hopeful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.